I don't usually work from notes, but with this gang I have to, because they truly are a distinguished set. And the qualifications and the resume that I'm going to just give you a brief summary of in each case is really just that, a brief summary. These are truly experts in the field of education. And you'll see by the presentations and by the questions and the way they were able to answer them that that's just the truth. We're going to start with Jamie Gass, who is a Pioneer Institute at the Pioneer Institute. He's the director of the Center for School Reform at the Pioneer Institute. In my notes I say he's framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers, numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education and reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Before, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as a senior policy analyst and technical writer, and in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. So without further ado, our first speaker, Mr. Jamie Gass.
So thank you, Mark, and I want to thank Helen, who I met just as I got here. It was really pleased to meet her because my oldest daughter, who's 8, her name's Helen too. But Michael Gendry and a variety of other folks that have helped set up these kinds of events all over the state. We've done probably 40 or 50 of them in the last 9, 10 months, and it's really been remarkable. So I want to just first of all begin by telling you what Common Core is, because the fact is that even though 40 some odd states have adopted, and that states are about 4 years into implementing the Common Core, the reality of it is that an enormous number of parents and people in the general public and state legislators, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, really have no idea what this is. What Common Core is a set of national English and math standards. Standards are usually driven by states, and what they do is they articulate what it is to be taught at the various grade levels. It's a general framework of academic instruction. And the Common Core was developed by the National Governors Association, which represents the governors of each state, and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents the commissioners of education in each state. Now, it's important to emphasize that these organizations, they're Washington, D.C.-based lobby groups, they don't represent states, right? They represent their membership, the governors and commissioners of each state. So one of the things we hear about Common Core is, well, it's state-led. Not really. It's D.C. lobby group led instead of states. And it's coupled with 2 national testing consortia, which will develop tests that will be aligned with the Common Core. So in Massachusetts, and we're in the process of having this debate about whether we're going to get rid of MCAS, which has been our state test, and replace it with PARCC, which is one of the testing consortia. And then the other testing consortia is called the Smarter Balanced Testing Consortia. So Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire are in Smarter Balance. And the funding for the Common Core really came, $200 million for the development of it and the advocacy for it has come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You know who Bill Gates is. He was the founder of Microsoft. I think he's, a remarkable guy in terms of, microtechnology. He just doesn't happen to know much of anything about K-12 education. The funding for the 2 testing consortia came to the tune of about $360 million, and that came directly from the U.S. Department of Education, and there are some problems with that, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. So I work for a place called Pioneer Institute. It's an independent think tank in Boston. We've been around for about 25 years or so. We've been one of the big drivers behind a lot of the education reform efforts going back to the early 1990s. The current governor, Charlie Baker, was our first executive director. The current Secretary of Education, Jim Pizer, was our executive director in the 90s. But we are independent and nonpartisan, and we, genuinely speaking, really like to call it like we see it. We look at the facts and the research and the evidence and the data. We accept no money from government, so we have a lot of independence. There's no deep-pocketed individual donor that's paying for the work that we're doing on it. We're doing it because it is the right thing to do, and on the merits of it, Common Core, from our point of view, has got some very, very serious problems. So to give you sort of some context, I'm going to kind of get you to the point where you'll understand why we're even having this conversation. about national standards, about state standards, about academic performance. I want to kind of give you some context, some historical context to help lead in. And to do that, I'm going to begin with a quote from James Madison. He's called the father of the Constitution. He wrote the Bill of Rights. And he wrote this in 1792 about the governance structure under which we live. And I think that there's probably no greater authority probably in the history of the country on governance than James Madison. And he said this: "If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion, it would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America." So, as I often say, the Founding Fathers were very far-sighted. They had a deep and thoroughgoing knowledge of history in order to frame our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. They looked from antiquity, Greece and Rome. They had all this experience as being Englishmen, all the things that they liked and didn't like about living as subjects under a king. And what they did in our Constitution, and it's really quite unique, not only in our time, but really going across history, is they really divided power between two separate kinds of governments. We have the national government, which does trade and foreign policy and defense, all of the big picture issues that have to do with mostly the sort of outlook of the country toward the rest of the world, right? But that most of the issues that most intimately are connected with the lives of citizens, and in particular schooling, they left to the states and localities. The U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on the issue of K-12 education, whereas the state constitution, like the Massachusetts Constitution, which was written by John Adams in 1780 and is the oldest written constitution in the world, has paragraph after paragraph describing precisely the role that K-12 education is supposed to serve as the wellspring for our self-government and for our Commonwealth. Right? So the national government, Founding Fathers, they left this completely silent. And that's not an accident. They wanted the decisions related to self-government owned and legally controlled and funded by the people that are connected to that work. Makes good sense, right? I'd argue that arrangement of the national government doing the things that it can do well and the state governments doing the things that it can do well has basically taken this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard in over 200 years has made us the most powerful country in the world. I mean, it's no small accomplishment. You can't name another country in the world that has enjoyed this kind of success and prosperity. It was not inevitable, right? It took leadership. It took knowledge of history. It took a constitution that understood the best ways to organize human beings, right? And again, this arrangement served us well, and it was reflected in our schools, too. They always understood that public schooling was supposed to be this wellspring. If we were going to be self-governing citizens, that our students and our citizens had to be educated in the principles of our republic, about the founding documents, about human nature, about the things that bind us together as human beings. They had to understand these things because you wanted your neighbors to be well-educated enough to cast votes intelligently, right, and in an informed way. And this carried us well, really, until a little bit after World War II. But after World War II, we began to see some slippage. The country was largely recognized as being one of the highest performing countries in the world in terms of K-12 education. But in 1957, and many of you may remember it, I don't, but many of you do, was Sputnik. It was when the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into orbit. And they did it before us, and it really initiated the space race. And it began to occur to us, we were falling behind. We were falling behind our political rival, the Soviet Union, but we were also likely to be falling behind economically. It wasn't immediately apparent because the country had lots of advantages after World War II. Economy was booming, we were a big creditor nation, the rest of the nations, major industrialized countries in the world were decimated by war, and we were sitting at the peak. But The thing about a peak is you can be on the top and you can also be beginning to head down the other side. And what the evidence was getting clearer and clearer is that we were losing our edge. And this was really the narrative around K-12 education from the late 50s, really until dramatically in 1983. There was a report that was published by the U.S. Department of Education under President Reagan, and it was called A Nation at Risk. And what this report in 1983 said was, if we had the system of public education that we had, enforced on us by a foreign adversary, it would be an act of war. We were losing ground, we were losing our economic competitiveness, we were losing our knowledge of our history and the central elements of our democracy that was going to be very, very problematic. But what that report did not do was come up with lots of top-down prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to solve these problems. Because everybody across the political spectrum, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, everybody knew, what I mentioned earlier, is that there are limits on what the federal government could do in terms of K-12 education. So during the 80s, there was a variety of different fits and starts of ed reform efforts. Some places were big advocates of more school choice, that by having school choice, we'd create competition among schools, and that parents and students would have this choice, and that would improve things. But what began to really develop was a core group of people in Washington, D.C., and some of them are connected now with the Common Core, that really said the way to fix this is a one-size-fits-all set of national standards, tests, and curriculum that will be uniform across all of the states. Right? What Massachusetts did in 1993 as their response to it was not only unique across the country, but it has proven to be historically successful. And I want to just tell you a little bit about that because it helps you understand why Common Core is going to be a problem for this state. So in 1993, it was a very, very unique moment. We had Bill Weld, who was a moderate to liberal Republican governor, and then we had a guy named Tom Birmingham, who a pretty liberal Democrat from Chelsea, great relationship with organized labor. Mark Roosevelt, also pretty liberal Democrat, great relationship with organized labor. And I mentioned their party affiliation not to be partisan, but to say it was unique, because what happened is that these three guys got together and they crafted the landmark 1993 Education Reform Act. And what was in that Education Reform Act was not only good politics, but it was good policy. And what they decided to do was that they were going to make a minimum threshold that all communities across the state had to spend based on their ability to spend. Right? So the wealthier communities were going to have to, have a higher threshold, and the poorer communities alone. Right? But what they were also going to do is they were going to couple it together with a massive infusion of state dollars too, and they were going to be putting an enormous amount of money, particularly in the poor, low-performing districts, the cities, New Bedford, Fall River, Chelsea, Lawrence, Holyoke, Springfield. Right? Very, very progressive funding formula. In exchange for this massive infusion of money, and we've spent over $100 billion, that's billion with a B, in the last 20 years at the state and local level. In exchange for the money, we were going to do all the hard things that really hadn't been happening in K-12 education, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country in the previous decades. We were going to have a refocusing of the academic work of schools on the basics of English, math, science, and history. We weren't going to do fuzzy math, we weren't going to do self-esteem, we weren't going to do soft skills, we weren't going to do workforce training. Generally speaking, the outlook of it was going to be on academics, the basics. Focus on the basics. You're going to be fortunate enough to hear from Sandy Stotsky, who was the prime mover and the architect behind those standards, a little later. So, lots of money, high-quality academic standards in the basics, teacher testing, so the teachers are going to be held to the same high academic standards that the students were going to be, MCAS testing. They want to make sure that the graduation diploma meant something, that the kids could read it when they were graduating, and that there were going to be high stakes connected to it. So you had to pass the MCAS, and you folks probably all know about the MCAS, in order to graduate from high school. We're going to have some charter schools to inject some school choice into it. So it's an incredible